I'm very pleased to be here. I'm honored to have such a large audience. I'm afraid I'll do this talk in English because my Polish is virtually non-existent, but I hope if I'm not clear to you, just ask. Well, let's see. I'm going to talk with you a little bit on the view of IREP and my view on, well, the future of requirements engineering. I'm Hans. I worked in ICT for 35 years, 20 years in testing, and the last 5 years I do also on RE. I'm a trainer and consultant in the Netherlands, and I'm a member of the International Requirements Engineering Board. Well, let's see what I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you what requirements engineering was a little bit in the past, and what it's now, and how it will be developing in the future. In the past, we developed from the waterfall, by the waterfall. We went from wishes to the use of IT systems through a sequential path. The sequential path was from first analyzing the things, determining the requirements, and then handing it over to a development team who designed it, built it, tested it, and deployed it, and then the users started to use it. And the analyze phase was the client who was king, who told some ideas about what he wanted. And then the requirements engineer came, asked some questions, and then drew up a large pile of documentation documenting every requirement that he could get out of this client, this customer, this king. And then the requirements engineer went to a developer with his ideas on how this system should be built. These ideas were transferred to the mind of the developer, and the developer asked the whole team of developers to build something that would conform the requirements of the client. And in the meantime, many of the requirements got lost in the waste basket because, well, things were different, we encountered problems, time was not enough, anyway. And then at the end, when the developers proudly came up with the system they built, the client usually was not very pleased because, well, he wanted a palace and he got a nice single house, but it was not a palace. Well, that was what we call the old school of development. In the old school, it started with a client who asked for a system, then a requirements engineer who collects the requirements for that system, and then a project to build the system more or less in the way the client in the beginning intended. And now for something completely different, because, well, a few years ago, well, it started maybe 10 years ago or something, we had the Agile Storm. Nowadays, I don't know how it's in Poland, but in Holland, well, virtually every project is done in some kind of agile development approach. And we went from the waterfall, which were nice, clear, separated phases, into what we call agile development. We rearranged everything in a way in which we develop systems in an incremental way by doing many iterations in which we step by step develop a system. And, well, from my point of view, a large improvement is that analysis is now no longer a single first step in development. It's spread over the whole agile iteration. You see business analysts participating in agile teams from the first start to the end of the delivery. And the next step would even be DevOps, in which we also get the actual use of the system into the cycle. And we see things like continuous integration and continuous deployment of small steps, small increments of the system. Well, that's the good news, I think. That's, in my view, it's a better way of developing systems. But we have a problem. Because requirements, the thing of requirements tends to be underestimated in this new development. Usually, agile teams do not really pay attention to requirements. They say it's the problem of the product owner. And the product owner, well, he's a sort of Superman. He comes from the business and usually has a management role there. And he should be full-time assigned to the project, being relieved from his management tasks in the business. He represents the business, not only his own department, but the whole business. So he should know all ins and outs of all stakeholders and be an expert in whatever he is doing and whatever the system will be doing. But he also must know everything about IT, and he must know everything about Agile. So that's the guy who's responsible for the requirements, and he manages the product backlog. Well, if I see this list, if someone presents me this requirements for a product owner, I always say, do you believe in fairy tales? I never meet this kind of product owners in real life. And from this situation, we see 4 common misconceptions about requirements in Agile. And I like to explain them. The first one is the left in the upper corner. That's what we call upfront is evil. From the idea from the waterfall that every requirement should be worked out completely in all detail in the first phase, which was impossible, of course. Now we think in Agile we do not do anything upfront, but that's also a misconception. You should do something upfront. You should have a product vision. You should have some epics giving the direction of the development. You should have some release teams on how to complete your system and how to do the steps in the sequence. The next one is the upper right one. That's the idea that user stories are enough. We have user stories and, well, we don't need requirements. Well, let me first point out to you, user stories are requirements. But the problem with user stories is that they focus on functionality. And that's why in many Agile projects we have difficulties with the non-functionals. The non-functionals in Agile are often hidden in acceptance criteria. And the problem with when you hide them in the acceptance criteria is that they are treated step by step, only looking at an individual user story. But to see the whole picture, to see how everything relates to each other, that's difficult when you only have a backlog with user stories. And to keep a whole backlog consistent, well, there's no mechanism in a backlog to make sure that this happens. So that's the problem with user stories. The next problem in Agile, the next misconception about requirements in Agile is the lower left one. Documentation is waste. Well, some first Agile projects started without any documentation. We later found out that that was a little bit too much, but still documentation is, well, it's not treated very attentionally in Agile projects. But documentation is a means to convey concepts from one head to another head over time and space. And if you need to know something about a certain concept in 6 months, even if I myself want to remember something in 6 months, I write it down. Documentation isn't waste. But the waste is when you produce documentation without a target group. If you
document everything just because, well, you think you need documentation. But if there's a true cause for documentation, there's no point in not documenting in Agile. So we may put things on paper, even if there are requirements. The last one, the last misconception is the idea that only working software counts. Many Agile sprints only count the fact that they produce a product increment. But if you produce new knowledge, if you produce a procedure, if you develop a training, that's also things that are useful. So don't focus only on product increments. And for all these things you have requirements. So let's see some new ways of looking into requirements engineering for the future. The change that I see in the field of requirements engineering is that we go from requirements to requirements engineering. We go from descriptive to creative. And the task for the requirements engineer is not to document something that the client has already in his mind, but to look to the needs of the client, to analyze the landscape of problems and goals that live in the context of the client, and then develop a solution where the client can choose from. And only after the client has deliberately made a choice for a certain solution, then you can start in elucidating the requirements for it. So that's what I call the landscape of problems and goals in the context of a client. They are related to each other. You can't have a problem without a goal, because a goal always is going away from the problem. You can't have a goal without a problem, because if there's no problem, well, the goal will be reached anyway, so you won't discern it as a goal. And only for relevant problem and goal pairs, it's useful to develop develop ideas about solutions. That's the task of a requirements engineer. And then you can give a menu of possible problem and goal pairs with possible solutions to a client and let them choose based on benefits of this solution, based on the cost of this solution, based on the time scale, based on the risk that are related to this solution. And only from there you can enter an agile development way, in which there are many points in which requirements engineering has an added value. Does this pointer work? Let me see. Yes. The first step is the initial definition. You must start with some product definition, and that is requirement engineering. That is where it's useful to use techniques from requirements. You have the selection phase, in which you select user stories from your product backlog and get them in the sprint backlog. Then there's the development phase, in which developers develop from your iteration backlog. But then there's a validation. And you can do upfront validation, you can do validation after your development. These are all things in which requirements engineering plays an important role. And then at the end we have a product demo or something. It ends up with some feedback from the stakeholders, and you update your product backlog. That's also a part in which requirements engineering can play a role. So that's what I call the new school of requirements engineering. It's now no longer writing down some requirements that the client already has in its head. No, it starts with a client who asks for help, then a requirements engineer who analyzes the context and proposes solutions, and then a project that builds the system while developing the requirements, while elaborating them in time, while refining them in time, step by step. And all through the project, it's not the first phase, all through the project, requirements engineering is playing an important role. So that's, for me, that's the happy end of requirements engineering in the near future. I think requirements engineering is far too important for any project to leave it only to the product owner. It's, in fact, it's a task that belongs to every developer. You have a business analyst who plays a part, you have developers who must understand it, you have testers who work with requirements. For instance, if you're a tester and you develop acceptance criteria, you're doing requirements engineering. You could use technique from requirements. So we end up with what I call the RE manifesto. We look a little bit at the Agile manifesto and we copied and pasted it a little bit. So we think requirements engineering is a cornerstone for delivering IT systems that produce value for customers. And, well, yeah, the same thing. In the old school, things like models, templates, and techniques were important. Comprehensive elicitation was important. Upfront specification was important. And proper documentation was important. It still is. But now we found out that the true success factors for requirements engineering are in empathy. Empathy for your client, understanding the context of the client, looking through the eyes of the client, through the world, to its problem, to its goal. Creative solution design. We don't have clients who want to see a list of their requirements. We have clients who want to see their problems solved. And upfront specification, well, it was nice in the waterfall, but nowadays, well, we can start with a small but conclusive list of some epics, some product vision. But in-time elaboration must be done during the sprints. Every cycle, again, will groom the backlog and elaborate requirements at the point in time where we have sufficient knowledge to do so. And the last thing, and for me it's the most important thing, is shared understanding. Documentation is often a poor way of sharing thoughts, talking to each other, sharing visions, doing presentations, doing talks, doing stand-ups. Well, it's important and it's part of requirements. So for me, the basic factors on the left are still important, but the success factors are the factors. Well, I changed left and right now. But, well, you know what I mean. And that's my happy end for the future of requirements engineering, and I hope it won't end in the near future. So we'll do a wonderful job to help our clients to develop useful IT systems that produce value for the business. We'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you for your attention.
Do you have any questions? No questions, Don. Hi.
The second sentence is especially interesting, creative solutions over comprehensive elicitation. Can we create a solution without knowing exactly what the customer needs without this comprehensive elicitation? Could you please say something more about this?
Yeah, well, we can't, that's what I mean with empathy. You must be able to look through the eyes of the customer. So, but it's an iterative process. You do some elicitation, you ask questions to him, you try to understand their problems, their goals, and then you can give a clue in which direction you think of possible solutions, and then you do. It's working together. You can't say we first do all the elicitation and then here's the solution. No, you develop it step by step together with this client. It's not one step. And well, but the focus is now more on things like understanding the problems of the client, make clear what the goals are of the client. One of the problems in the past was that we often developed systems for a goal that at the end was not the real goal of the client. It was the goal the client told us, and we started elucidating on it. And then when we delivered the system, it appeared that the client had a more important goal lying behind its original goal. First, you must understand, you must empathize with him to understand what he really needs. Have this client choose between different ways of developing the system. That answers your question? Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? If you're shy and you want to talk with Hans in private,
That's
you can find. Okay, I can see a volunteer.
I have a question about this agile approach to the project. What do you think? This main analyst document is at the low-level design. It should be complicated or clear and easy to understand for the business. And also, what do you think? It is better to think about the work of it electronically. For example, maybe it's some kind of wiki of our Confluence than paper documents in this time.
Well, what I see is that we have a shift in prototyping. We must do much more in prototyping because, well, just telling things, documenting, even in a wiki is better than just a plain Word document, I agree. But clients usually only realize what they really need if they see it. And it don't have to be working prototype, but a screen flow or a wireframe sketch of how the things will interact with the customer also have very much value. So documenting is maybe not so important, but having during the course of your development prototypes that really make clear to the client what he will get. That's what I think is the new way of working. Tomorrow, well, I may have some promotion. Tomorrow I have another talk, and well, I'll talk some more about design thinking and that sort of thing. That's
Maybe you didn't notice, but actually this is not the only one conference in Singapore. There is actually another one just for us, and Hans is a speaker there too. So if you want to stay in Torun, you can stay. Okay. Any other questions?
Hello. So you already used the word, but since I'm not going to join tomorrow, but could you elaborate more on design thinking as a technique, perhaps for requirements gathering?
Well, it will take me 1 hour, 1 hour extra, but well, you can see on the internet. Just look in the design thinking and the word design thinking, Google on it. But design thinking places more accent on empathizing and on prototyping.
Exactly. But have you used it, and what's the perception?
Well, I'm a teacher, so I don't really use things, but I explain things, and I'm really, I'm really enthusiastic about it.
Yes, I also did a training, but I'm participating in some workshops, but never as a requirements gathering.
Okay, well, I'm developing a workshop on design thinking, but well, it won't be ready until spring next year. But you're welcome to join that.
Anyone else? Okay, so thank you very much, Hans.
You're welcome.
Please